What if we had to cut a tree to save the forest? And what if environmentalists, forest managers, and forest products business owners were working together to restore our forests? And what if there was a revolutionary new eco-friendly building product that came from the byproduct of restoring those forests? The good news is all of those are true. I'm from the northeast corner of Washington State, a little town called Colville, in the Colville National Forest. And there, we've tackled some pretty incredible issues to start solving some of the problems that are in our forests. And we've used things like interests versus positions and abundance rather than scarcity to get there. Let me tell you a story. After World War II, we had a growing nation that required a lot of building. The building product of choice was wood. And we used our national forests, the federally owned forests that you and I own, to fuel that boom. And from the 40s, 50s, through to the 80s, that volume steadily grew as our nation grew. But the focus was primarily on economics. And small rural communities thrived, businesses grew. But there was also a growing population in the United States that was asking questions on whether we should value other things from our forests than just economics. And what started as a dull murmur got louder and louder over the years. And in the 60s and 70s, the environmental movement really started to become a true movement. But at the same time, we continued to manage these forests. In some ways, people would say it was aggressively. And by 1988, we had harvested more timber than we ever had before off of our federal lands. A few years later, these environmentalists that had been growing frustrated that nobody was really listening to them discovered that they could challenge these federal timber sales with lawsuits. And they did so probably more successfully than they even knew. By the mid-1990s, that volume of timber that was coming off those federal forests had reduced by more than 90%. Many of these timber-dependent communities were drying up. Businesses were going out of business. People were losing their jobs, and it was a very tough situation. So as that happens in these small communities, there's a ripple effect of negativity. My family didn't escape that. I come from a forest products family business, and we had, in 1988, 3 sawmills and 500 employees that had grown up from humble beginnings in the 50s. And by the mid-2000s, we had laid off 400 employees and closed 2 mills. So it was difficult. But many of those environmentalists also lived in the communities in which we managed these forests and had these businesses being shut down. This period of time is what's referred to as the timber wars. And it really wasn't fun for anybody. But I think it was necessary for us to understand that sometimes we need to reset. In 2002, my father reached out to some of the local and regional environmentalists and asked them to sit down and talk. And that was the watershed moment that created the Northeast Washington Forestry Coalition, of which I'm a part of. It's based on the Colville National Forest in Colville. And it's been a real interesting ride. And when we first got started, the Forest Service, the federal agency that's required, that is used to manage our federal lands, decided that it would be good for us to hire a facilitator. And I don't think that facilitator knew how successful that facilitation was. They taught us to think in terms of interests rather than positions, and abundance rather than scarcity. And let me give you a real-life example, because interests and positions are similar, but they're just words until you put them in context. There's an actual company out there whose company policy is no new wilderness. They felt that by supporting any wilderness, that would somehow harm their ability to get more timber from the federal forests. So they want no legislated, new protected wilderness. At the same time, you have environmental communities and environmental organizations. One is the Wilderness Society, and others, their main tenet are protecting these backcountry beautiful places. So those two positions seem like they're diametrically opposed. You'd go into discussions and you'd think you're at an impasse. But as soon as we start talking about interests, we start learning that both the timber company and the environmentalists value healthy forests, value clean, cool water. They value vibrant communities and economies. And actually, they both value protected backcountry places. So once you see that you have similar interests, you can develop common ground and you can develop trust. And that's a hard thing to do when you think about the context of the timber wars, when these people felt like they were enemies. But that example is what's happened, and it's come together. And over time, we've been successful at managing this forest land in such a way that I think you'll find interesting. We started focusing on what the forest needs, because many people don't realize it, but a lot of our federal forests, in particular in the area that's around the Rocky Mountains, the Intermountain West, the fire-prone landscape, is in really bad shape. And there's a reason it's in really bad shape, and there's a reason that we really cannot leave it alone. You see, we have wildfires in our forests on a regular basis. And naturally, in the past, they were very intermittent, 5 to 15, maybe 20-year intervals. And these fire-dependent trees, these large trees, have thick bark and they have limbs that are high off the ground. So when those fires come in there, they burn the understory, they burn the competing trees, and it stays nice and open and thin. When we had massive wildfires in this country around 1910, we developed a policy from the Forest Service to put out every fire that started. That protected communities. However, all of a sudden we introduced something that's unnatural to the landscape by removing fire. But by managing our forests aggressively up until 1988, it was masked because we were removing that vegetation. Now, we need to go in and try to mimic what Mother Nature was doing and build a business around that. And that's what we're doing. We're actually focused on what's supposed to be out there naturally, and the byproduct of getting there are what we're building our businesses around. Because people don't realize this, but the technology in sawmilling allows us to effectively utilize 4.5-inch top diameter to about as large as the steering wheel in your car. We're not talking about utilizing big trees. We're talking about utilizing the small trees that most likely would have been burned off in the past. We think that's critically important because the pollution from these fires are something we're just beginning to understand, because the forests are so thick and the smoke is so toxic that it's not like being around a campfire. When you go to these areas after a fire, the soil is almost completely dead. It looks like a moonscape. And that was never intended to be that way. But we have an opportunity to fix that. The other really interesting thing I alluded to is the revolutionary new building products that are out there. Mass timber is a new way that we can build. It's already happening in Europe. It's been happening for over a decade, and it's growing rapidly. It's where we can take those small diameter trees, cut them into dimensional lumber, 2x4s, 2x6, 2x8, use eco-friendly adhesives, glue them together to create a new eco-friendly building product that actually stores the carbon that's embedded in those trees when they perform photosynthesis, and we put them in those buildings. And those buildings can last for centuries. It can help us combat climate change and carbon pollution. these buildings are also incredibly beautiful because of the natural elements of wood. We're excited to see that happen. As we move forward today, do I want you to just think about the fact that we're managing forests in a better way and that we're creating new, innovative, revolutionary building products? Absolutely. But what I want to do is I want you to hear how we got there, how we used interests instead of positions, and abundance rather than scarcity to guide your life and the collaborations that you need to go through. How can you sit with somebody maybe that seemingly has a different position than you do and drill down into the interests rather than focusing on those positions? Because if you get to those interests, you start to develop common ground. And when you develop common ground, you develop respect and trust. And then all of a sudden, magical things can happen. And if you couple that with abundance, where you think about things in layers rather than slicing up a pie into smaller pieces, you might find that by helping somebody else get what they want, you might be able to get more of what you want. Thank you.